Hey friends, welcome back to Homestead on a Prayer. Today we are going to be planting out the squash. Now, you can see here I have some squash that I've started in pots. Today we're going to be talking about 3 different ways that are basically different options that you can use to start your squash. So I have a variety of different squashes here and some melons as well. You can see some of them have just barely started sprouting while some of them are large and definitely ready to get in the ground. So often people will start their squash by planting a seed directly in the ground, which is one option. It's actually one of the 3 options we're going to be talking about today. That's called direct sowing. And a lot of people do that because squash really doesn't like its roots disturbed. You can see I have these squash transplants here, and I'm going to be very careful when I transplant them into the ground, but their roots are still going to have to go through a little bit of adjusting because basically they've lived their whole lives in these little pots here, and we're going to be taking them and moving them to a completely different environment out in the garden. So squash is one of those plants that is a little bit less forgiving when it comes to having roots disturbed. So for that reason, a lot of people like to direct sow it. And I do pretty much exclusively direct sow my summer squash. When I first started growing zucchini, a lot of times what I would do is start some plants inside ahead of time, basically to get a couple week head start in the season. And then when I planted those out in the garden, I would direct sow seeds for more zucchini at the same time. And what I found was that year after year, the zucchini that I direct sowed, the seeds that I planted directly in the garden, once they germinated, they would quickly catch up to the zucchini that I had transplanted just because they didn't have to deal with that shock of switching environments and having their roots disturbed. But when it comes to winter squash, I have personally not had the greatest success with direct sowing winter squash. Even winter squash winter squash has a longer maturity date because you're harvesting it as a mature fruit. Basically, summer squash like zucchini, if we let that go, I'm sure you've seen pictures of people who have missed the zucchini under those huge squash leaves and ended up with huge zucchinis. If you let those go, they would eventually develop a really hard rind like what we think of with winter squash. Because there's a little bit more time that it takes for that to fully happen, for the squash to fully mature, winter squash is harvested later in the growing cycle. That means that it takes longer to mature. But even with that consideration, some winter squash does mature fairly quickly. Even winter squash that should have easily been able to mature within my growing season, I found it just wasn't working. So this year I'm going to experiment with a few different ways to grow squash. So you can see, as I mentioned, I have some of my winter squash here. Some of these are melons as well, which basically the same principles apply to melons. So we will be transplanting out these transplants today. Additionally, I am going to be experimenting with direct sowing some seeds for each of these same varieties. We'll stick some seeds directly in the ground today. And I made these little collars. Basically, this is just a toilet paper tube that I cut up, and we're going to put these around basically each seed that we put in the ground to hopefully prevent damage from insects when the seed first germinates. Additionally, I have a third method that we're going to be planting today as well. So in this Ziploc baggie here, I have pre-sprouted some seeds. We have some winter squash in here. I've got some melons and some cucumbers as well. Basically, we'll look at the cucumbers because those are the easiest to see. You can see how these seeds are starting to sprout. Basically, the plant is starting to emerge from those seeds there. So all I did with these was take a little bit of a damp paper towel and fold some seeds from each variety. You can see that I have it labeled with many different varieties in here. And basically what happens is that just allows the seed a peaceful place, a nice dark place, to be able to absorb the water that it needs to germinate from the paper towel. The idea is that as soon as it starts to sprout, you're going to transplant it into the ground, because this way you've accomplished the germination process, but we're going to transplant it today before it has a chance to really develop a root system. So that should hopefully prevent some of the transplant shock that squashes are pretty susceptible to. So using these 3 methods here, this is starting inside and transplanting, direct sowing some seeds, and then planting some pre-sprouted seeds. I'm hoping that by doing some of each variety this way this season, we can really do a side-by-side comparison and see which way really works best, at least in my garden. So we're out here in the side yard garden today. You can see I have basically a mixed bed behind me. I've got some tomatoes, some broccoli, kale, lots of stuff growing in this bed here. But along this trellis, what I'm planning to grow is miniature pumpkins. So I have 2 varieties of pumpkins that I've started. I have Jack B. Little, which is basically those mini flat orange pumpkins, and I have Baby Boo, which is similar but white. So I was thinking having this whole arch covered with tiny pumpkins might be a really fun thing to do with this back trellis here. So I have 2 plants of each of those varieties that I've started from transplants. We'll be transplanting those out. I think I'm going to put the transplants on this side. And then on the opposite side of the trellis here, I plan to start some direct sown seeds and also some of the seeds from the Ziploc baggie. The reason, you can see I have this whole bed full of garlic, and I forgot to leave enough space to transplant here. So we're going to put the seeds in here because they won't take up as much space. And then behind me, where I have a little bit more space and I can more easily transplant, we'll put the started seedlings. So here I've separated out my 2 seedlings of each of these varieties, so those will get planted along the trellis here. Incidentally, while we're here, this is where I grew potatoes last year, and as you can see, I think I missed harvesting a few because these plants just sprouted up. So I'm not actually officially growing potatoes this year, but we might get a little surprise harvest. So I'm just going to space these 4 plants evenly along this fence here, and I think I have actually never grown these before, but I think these are on the small side, so I may end up planting another seed or 2 along this trellis as well. This plant here, this is a Baby Boo. The stem did get damaged a little bit. I don't know if you can really see that there. I'm going to plant it anyway and hope that it recovers, but I know that we may end up losing that one. So I'm going to start at this end with a Jacoby Little. So this is the mini orange pumpkin. Just going to dig a hole in the soil about the size of this pot. And I'm going to, as gently as possible, transplant this in without messing with the roots at all. And just bring this over here so that as soon as it puts out tendrils, it can start climbing the trellis. So now, next to this potato plant, I'm going to make a little hole for our first Baby Boo. And this is the one with the damaged stem. So I'm going to plant it a little bit more deeply and try to bury the part that's damaged, and hopefully it will be able to regrow and root. So you can see this is pretty severely damaged. Normally I wouldn't have any hope, but it was damaged days ago and it still looks actually okay. So we'll try this and hope for a miracle when it comes to this plant here. So here you can see the seeds that I've started for these 2 varieties. This is Baby Boo here. So you can see that they are just starting to sprout, but they don't really have a root system yet. So by putting them in the ground like this, I won't be disturbing them. So I'm going to try to plant 1 of each variety along the same side of the trellis. So this little Jacoby Little pumpkin is just barely starting to sprout. Just going to poke a little hole into the soil and set it in place. And then right over where I planted it, I'm going to put this collar. The past couple years, I've been having an issue with some sort of creature, I think an insect, maybe a cutworm or something like that, eating my seedlings as soon as they germinate. Basically, they'll germinate, and then the next day I'll come out and the top of the seedling will be gone. So I'm hoping, I'm not sure if this is going to work or not, but I'm hoping by putting this little ring around the seedlings, it'll hopefully protect them long enough that they can get more established before they have to deal with pests. So I'll definitely keep you updated about how that works. On this side of the trellis by the garlic, I will be direct sowing some of both of each of these seedlings and planting a couple more of those germinated seeds from the paper towels. So I think what I'll do is I'll plant 2 of the sprouted seeds of each variety and 1 direct sown seed. But what I'll probably do is put 2 of the direct sown seeds in each hole and then thin to the strongest seedling if they both happen to germinate. So I'm just going to poke about a 1-inch hole into the soil, and I have 2 here of the Jacoby Little seeds. I'll just put those in and cover them up. Next, I'll do the same with Baby Boo, the white variety, right here. Next, along that side of the trellis, I'll put 2 seeds of each variety from the paper towel germinated seeds. So this back trellis here is all planted with mini pumpkins, alternating orange and white, and I'm hoping those will be really beautiful this summer and fall. Next, this middle trellis here, I think that I am going to do a mix of squash, probably honey nut and butternut. And then finally, this last trellis here, you can see we've got the asparagus on one side and I've got tomatoes on the other. I think this one will be melons. So I have 3 varieties of melons I'm planning to grow. I have Minnesota Midget, which is basically a mini personal cantaloupe. I have the Kajari melon, which is another personal size melon. I think it's kind of similar to a cantaloupe. And I have Hale's Jumbo, which is another cantaloupe variety as well. So I will be planting those along this trellis here. Additionally, I have a couple other plants that I'm not growing on a trellis. I have butterbush, which is a bush version of butternut squash, so it kind of grows like a zucchini. We've got, that's another butterbush. Here's a Kajari melon. Muskie de Provence, I have no idea if I pronounced that right, but this is a medium-sized pumpkin that will be just sprawling along one of my beds. And I also have sugar pie pumpkin, which will be sprawling also. So basically all of these different squashes and melons here, I will be planting the same way. Just at various places in the garden, I'll be transplanting these transplants that I've started. I'll be direct sowing some more seeds. And finally, I will be planting some of these pre-sprouted seeds. I also did pre-sprout some cucumbers, as I mentioned. I planted my cucumbers, I transplanted them out into the garden. But I wanted to experiment with pre-soaking some seeds as well. I have my blackberry plants, which you can see are starting to flower. But these are young blackberry plants and they're not taking up a lot of space yet. I spaced them pretty widely because they ultimately will take up a lot of space. But in these spaces in between where the blackberries are, I plan to grow cucumbers this year, and basically until the blackberries get large enough they need the space. And then over along this fence, I have some lemon balm, but I have spaces between the lemon balm as well. So I'm going to be planting some of my pre-sprouted cucumbers and possibly melons as well, if I have extra of those. So when you have somewhat limited space like I do, at least compared to the amount of plants that I want to grow, what I like to do is to maximize the space possible. You know, I have that fence that my blackberries are growing against, and in front of me I have the fence that my lemon balm is growing against. But those plants are not going to take up all the space, at least not right now. So I want to maximize that space and fill it with cucumbers and possibly melons as well. Additionally, you can see all these beds behind me are full of a variety of vegetables and fruits. But these trellises that I have here use mostly walkway space, and I can just use a couple inches on the edge of each bed and then let them grow over the trellis. So that's another way to really maximize the space possible. So I'm just going to get planting with all this variety of plants, and I'll meet you back here and show you how everything turned out once we're done. So at the end of this trellis here, these 2 seedlings are honey nut squash, and I poked in some additional seeds that had been soaking for butternut squash, a climbing butternut, and another honey nut as well. And then if we go across the walkway, in my strawberry bed, you can't really see anything, but I put some seeds in here as well for the same, for honey nut squash and butternut squash. Down here, I planted my melons along this fence here. Same thing, I've got some seedlings that I transplanted in. I put in some seeds, both some direct sown seeds and some pre-sprouted seeds from the paper towel. And along this side you can see as well. Along this fence by the blackberries, I ended up putting all my extra melon seeds here. Basically I had extra seeds to use up, and I put all the pre-sprouted seeds in there. And then along this fence, all the cucumbers of various kinds too. As we head into the main garden area, you'll see that we did some planting in here as well. This bed here, I planted my pumpkin seedlings. And I forgot to pre-sprout some seedlings of these in the paper towel, but I did direct sow a few seeds in here as well. And then across the walkway, here are my butterbush squashes. And down here you can see a second one. I did not plant any additional seeds of these because I think 2 plants will be enough for this one. Thank you so much for hanging out with me in the garden today and getting all these plants planted. I had a lot of fun getting these planted and just dreaming about what they're going to look like as the season goes on. So now, as the season progresses, I just want to compare how the different types of plants do so that I can find what works best, at least for me in my garden, and I would love to share those results with you. So thank you so much for hanging out with me today. I hope that you are having a great day, and I can't wait to see you soon. I'll see you next time.